You don't have to expose anyone, just reflect them. You don't need to argue, you don't need to correct. You don't even need to explain. Just stop absorbing and start reflecting. Because people don't show you who they are when you ask. They show you when you don't respond. When you say nothing, they project. When you hold still, they reveal. When you don't play their game, they start exposing their own code. That's the cold mirror. You don't resist. You don't defend. You let them bounce off you until their own reflection becomes unbearable. And most can't handle that. They need you to react, so they don't have to face themselves. They'll say you're distant. They'll say you're cold. But what they really mean is, I can't control your emotional surface anymore. And that's exactly the point. Because when you stop reflecting emotion, you start reflecting truth. Not yours, theirs. You don't break them. You let the silence fracture the illusion they built to feel in control. People don't see you. They project themselves onto you. Most people don't actually see you. They see a mirror and project themselves onto it. Their fears, their insecurities, their expectations, their unprocessed loops. And when you don't react the way they want, they panic because your stillness gives them nothing to grab onto. No validation, no correction, no emotional reassurance. And in that space, they start filling in the blanks. They say you're distant because they're afraid of being ignored. They say you're cold because they feel disconnected from themselves. They say you don't care because they need constant signals to feel safe. It has nothing to do with you. It never did. But the moment you react, you confirm the projection. You become what they decided you are. You enter their story. And now, you're no longer the mirror. You're the actor in a narrative they wrote to avoid facing their own. That's how most people operate. They don't want the truth. They want relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from doubt. Relief from what they don't understand about themselves. So they test you. Poke, push, performance. And if you react, they feel stable again. But if you hold still, if you reflect instead of absorb, they become unstable. Not because you hurt them, but because you didn't give them a way to avoid themselves. That's what cold mirror does. It doesn't punish, it reveals. And when someone has spent their whole life avoiding their reflection, silence becomes confrontation. You're not making them uncomfortable. Their own projection is. The more you explain, the more you validate their projection. They say, you're distant. You don't care. You're acting cold. And what do? You explain. You clarify. You justify your tone, your silence, your choices. Not because you believe them, but because you want them to feel better. You want to fix the discomfort. But in doing so, you don't just comfort them, you confirm them. You validate the frame they just projected onto you. Now you're no longer in your position. You've stepped into theirs. And from that moment forward, they don't see you as you are. They see you as what you defended. You defended being distant. Now they believe it more. You explained why you're not cold. Now they're convinced you are. You explained your silence. Now they call it manipulation. That's the trap. Because every time you try to correct their perception, you're entering their story and abandoning your own. Why? Because you're trying to soothe pain you didn't cause, just to avoid being misunderstood. Their emotion, their tension, their assumptions. And you think explaining will fix it. But all it does is make their story stronger. Cold mind doesn't play that game. It doesn't defend what's not under attack. It doesn't answer to projections. It doesn't rescue people from their own reflection. Because the moment you react, you shift from reflection to absorption. And when that happens, you lose the edge. When you start defending who you are, you've already agreed that it's in question. 3 cold mirror tactics. They keep you clear, calm, and in control. Cold mirror isn't passivity. It's strategic presence. You're not disappearing. You're staying so still. They can't tell where their projection ends, and your silence begins. Here's how to hold that edge. 1. Don't absorb. Reflect. The moment you absorb, you become reactive. Their pain becomes your job. Their tone becomes your pressure. Their confusion becomes your responsibility. Cold mirror changes that. You hear the message, but you let it bounce. You don't defend. You don't fix. You reflect it back by doing nothing. And in that nothing, they start hearing themselves without interference. That's when truth shows up. 2. Let silence be the surface. Silence makes people reach, fill in the blanks, overexpose. It's not coldness, it's space. You hold that space long enough, and their need to fill it becomes their undoing. You don't interrupt. You don't nod in agreement. You don't push back. You stay still until they can't handle the weight of their own sentence. Let them trip on their own narrative. 3. Let the loop collapse. Without you, emotional loops need you to participate. You react, they react, escalation. But what happens if you don't enter? You don't say, "Let's talk about it now." You don't text first. You don't chase the tension. You let it breathe. And in that breath, the loop breaks itself. Because every manipulation, every projection, every emotional pressure requires your agreement. No agreement equals no loop. You're not cold. You're just done being a sponge for energy that isn't yours. Cold mirror doesn't remove connection. It clarifies it. It shows who can handle reflection and who's been avoiding it their whole life. You don't need to fight their projection. You just need to stop catching it. She didn't react. He ended up confronting himself. He came in sharp, accusatory, passive-aggressive, loaded with emotional pressure. You've changed. You're not like before. You don't even care, do you? She didn't flinch, didn't defend, didn't soften her voice to calm things down. She just looked, present, still, silent. And that silence, it didn't create distance. It created a mirror. He filled it with projection, with assumption, with the tension he didn't want to face in himself. She didn't absorb it. She didn't block it. She reflected it, not by saying, "You're projecting," but by letting the projection collapse under its own weight. Because the more he spoke, the more tangled he got. He contradicted himself. He repeated emotional scripts he had used on others, and realized they weren't working here, because she wasn't feeding them. No validation, no resistance, just stillness. And that's when it happened. He paused, looked away, exhaled, and said, "Maybe I'm the one who's reacting." Not because she called him out, but because her lack of reaction forced him to hear his own voice with no echo to blame. That's cold mirror. You don't use it to control people. You use it to refuse participation in stories that were never yours. And sometimes, just by not reacting, you give someone their first clear look at who they've been. Silence doesn't make people feel ignored. It makes them hear themselves louder than they ever expected. Final message. You don't have to correct anyone. Just let the mirror do its work. You're not here to fix their assumptions. You're not here to edit their stories. You're not here to absorb what isn't yours. You're here to hold, to reflect, to remain unmoved. Because the moment you start defending, you've stepped into their frame. You've accepted their lens. You've agreed to react inside their story. And that's how you lose the edge. Cold mirror doesn't need to prove. It doesn't need to counter. It doesn't even need to win. It just reveals. And reflection is louder than reaction. The more still you are, the more exposed they become. And in that exposure, they have two choices: see themselves or blame the mirror. Either way, you didn't lose your position. You held it. You don't assert power by pushing. You secure it by staying still. You hold power by not giving them anything to push into. That's not indifference. That's command. Because silence isn't absence. Stillness isn't weakness. And not reacting is sometimes the loudest thing you'll ever say. In the next video, we'll expose the fragile manipulator, how weakness is used as control, and why cold mind never bends to emotional theater dressed as truth. Subscribe, reflect more, absorb nothing.